The foot are staying here, man. Alright.
How's it going, Dr. Josh?
Too bad. How are you, Dean?
Pretty good, man. I can't tell you. We are so grateful that you agreed to join us today.
Oh,
Thank you very
no
much.
thing at all.
I hope your contacts are working.
Yeah, they are. I gotta get new ones because I don't know, the right one is
Wow,
bugging me like crazy. So.
I assume with all the readings you do,
Mm.
the ancient stuff.
It's frustrating.
Yeah, but what can I say? First, congratulations on the twins.
Yeah, thank you.
You're
Appreciate
welcome, and congratulations on the book, man. So
Yeah, it's been quite a year.
that was a brain crusher. I read it twice, and I'm gonna have to read it again and again. I mean, you packed a punch.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's I think it turned out okay. I think it turned out okay.
No, it's phenomenal. I think it was about time that someone wrote a book like that, and you jumped in.
I'm hoping that it's like volume 2 is going to cover all the Paul Copan stuff, so like genocide and violence and
so. Can you tell us the genesis of the project? I mean, the title says you meant exactly what the title said. When I thought it was going to be like a general thing, but when I read it, it was like a very easy to read, but yet also very academic. And
yeah, I mean, I think that sort of when we started the YouTube channel, I think that's when started noticing that Christian apologists online really taking notice of them and how they I don't know, they try to use the Hebrew Bible in particular in ways that it doesn't really work. It doesn't fit with what's actually going on in the text. And then the apologetics that they make to try to defend things like slavery and violence and all that stuff. It becomes really problematic. So the videos themselves on the channel were initially meant to sort of deal with some of those issues. But then I figured I'd done all this research into these particular topics, and given my background, I could probably bring something together that would be sort of a resourceful tool. I mean, a good resource. Sorry, I was up for about 5 hours last night with the twins. So
I'm sorry
if I'm a little off, I apologize.
I have kids myself. I understand.
But no, I thought that by putting something together that initially was just supposed to be, let's talk about some hot topic, hot button issues. But then as I kind of wandered through it, I thought, it would be good to just have something that would give everybody, in particular atheists and skeptics, but anybody that picked it up, this broad background to the Hebrew Bible and the ancient Near East. And so that's sort of where the first half of the book came from, is wanting to make it a much more robust resource for somebody who maybe isn't necessarily looking for a strict introduction to the Hebrew Bible, because I don't think that's what it is.
Yeah. Hey, Tim is joining us.
Hey, sorry I'm late. Had to make some coffee.
But yeah, it's meant to be sort of a one-stop shop for an atheist or a skeptic who is particularly online.
Yeah,
because this is where these arguments all come up, but particularly online or around like the dining room table at Thanksgiving. People that are interested in debating some of these more common topics that come up, that are brought up by apologists.
Well, it was definitely an eye-opener. I mean, especially the chapter with the slavery thing. I was like, I did not know any of that. because I come from a Muslim background, so it was yeah. So it's they have the same shit, in there. They always, sell the catchphrases because as we progressed, modern times, they start finding, back in the days, they never apologized. Now they are trying to find explanations for stuff. They keep saying, Islam came and abolished slavery, which is not. They did not. I mean, it codified it and just, said, yes, let's keep doing it. And then in the Bible, I never thought that they had such thing, but that chapter was like very intense.
I think the scariest part of the whole slavery discussion is that what you end up with, if you are a typical online apologist, and even some that do writing, you end up walking away from the discussion having defended a form of slavery.
Yeah.
It's really weird. It's just a weird position to end up in. Because the arguments always go like this. How can you, atheists will say, how could you worship a God who, would condemn shellfish, but can't find the time in all of his laws to say, don't own people as property? To which the apologist always says, well, let's start off with a couple of things. Instead of just saying slavery is bad, any kind of slavery is bad. What they end up saying is, well, I mean, think about the type of slavery that I don't even know that I would really call it slavery. It's more like debt servitude. Well, I mean, just stop for a second and think, what is debt servitude? What is debt slavery? It's, I loaned you money, you couldn't pay it back, so now you become my slave until you can pay it back. I mean, I don't know if we want to be defending that too terribly much. Like, it's not good.
For real.
So that's what ends up happening, and it's really scary to me, honestly, because as I talk about in the book, a lot of the legal rationalizations and the way that judges came to decisions, the tensions that they were wrestling with in the antebellum South, are oftentimes the same things that the biblical writers are wrestling with. How do you have a master? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
That was the thing that I never thought to hear when you put the antebellum South with that. I mean, I have never even crossed my mind. I was like, wait a minute, what is he doing here? And it's the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously there are differences. Maybe not. We don't. There are times that we just don't have enough information in the Hebrew Bible, but on some of the more salient points, it's incredibly similar. So, the thing that both the antebellum South and the Hebrew Bible are wrestling with, the tension that they're facing, is, well, masters have to be able to physically beat their slaves. And they have to be able to do that, right? That's the logic. They have to be able to do that because whether you're a debt slave and you're there for a set period of time, 6 years, or if you're a chattel slave and you're there indefinitely, what's your motivation, right? Well, I got to be here for 6 years, so I'm going to do the least that I can and get away with it. And a chattel slave, it's worse. I'm here forever, so I'm going to find my groove, and do as little work that I can, which is exactly what I would do, right? I mean, that's what we all would do, I suspect. And so masters, then the law is, then this is all bullshit, right? I mean, this is crazy.
It is 100% bullshit.
But the way the law is working with this is they're going, all right, so we have to make sure the masters have the right to beat their slaves, right? But we can't have them abusing them and murdering them.
Yeah,
and that's crazy. That's exactly what's going on in passages like Exodus 21, right? So I mean, if you think about what the passage says, if a man beats his male or female slave with a wooden rod,
and
they die immediately, it's obvious, you know, according to I think what most scholars would say about the passage, that what the text is trying to do is trying to mitigate abuse. And
Yeah.
so, all right, look, if you have a slave and you hit them with a wooden rod and they die immediately, it implies that you were doing more than just correcting them or trying to motivate them or
Yeah.
something. This was more than punishment. You were doing, you know, you were intending harm, serious harm. And so then the punishment is, you know, the punishment there is that you're killed. However, if the slave survives a day or two, well, then there is no punishment because he's his money, right? He's his property. And so the rationale there is we're in a world, we're in the ancient world, and it can be difficult to determine. So let's say, you know, I beat my slave in a normal way for moderate correction.
Standard way.
Right. The standard stuff. And something happens where he gets an infection.
Oh, crap.
Right. Or, and of course, they don't know what an infection is, but, you know, there's something else that intervenes during those couple of days that brings about the slave's death. Well, now it's like mitigating circumstances. All right, well, I guess what we have to do is we have to assume that the master was just giving moderate correction and that, you know, something else intervened and brought about the slave's death. And so we can't then hold him responsible because he was just doing what Proverbs encourages him to do.
That's
right?
true.
And this is exactly what we see in the antebellum South. I mean, if you read what the judges are saying,
the
judges,
I think the most terrifying, I mean, as horrible as it is, you know, the corporal punishment thing, when you were detailing the stuff about, like, you know, you go in as a slave, your master gives you a wife, you have kids, your 6 years is over, okay, you're out, but your kid's a wife stays in there. It's like, I think to me that was like more cruel and terrible that such regulation exists versus, you know, getting beaten up, which is terrible. But this one is like even takes the cake. I think the conversation stops when you know that. That's it. We're done.
Yeah. And it's interesting to hear apologists sort of try to work through that passage. I mentioned Paul Copan earlier. I don't know if you've read his book. He's got a new one out, but it is God a Moral Monster is the title of it. And he has 2 chapters dedicated to slavery in it. And he's a super nice guy. I've talked to him. But it's sort of the standard, it's a standard apologetics that you hear. And I think a lot of people are actually getting their arguments from his book. And about that passage in particular, he says, so, you know, what is the slave faced with? Well, and I'm paraphrasing, but he could leave and go save up his shekels to find a place to live and wait for his wife and children to have their term of service, you know, expire, and then they'd all live together. Or he could, you know, save up more money and go buy out, you know, the contract early, pay off the debt for his wife and his children. You know, or he could say, you know what, I got it pretty good here. I'm just gonna sign up for life. Well, I mean, first of all, there's this underlying assumption that the wife and the children are debt slaves.
Yeah.
They're not. They're chattel slaves. There is no term of service that ends with them.
Yeah, they're there.
So automatically, the passage doesn't make sense at all if they're debt slaves. Because and this is what I would encourage people to do in these circumstances. Just try to walk it through. You know, put it like add characters in your mind and say, okay, so Frank is, you know, the debt slave that goes in for 6 years, and he's single when he goes in. And about 2 years in, the master says, hey, here's Susie. This is my other slave, right? You guys, you know, get down with the get down. And so, you know, Frank and Susie get married. and now they have a couple of kids. So 6 years goes by, and the master says, "All right, Frank,
You're out.
it's been great, man. It's been great." But Susie and the kids, they're my property, right? That's how this works. I've even heard people say, well, I mean, Frank, the guy, he knew that he wasn't going to get to keep his wife and kids. He did it willingly. It was voluntary.
Jesus.
That's true. That's true. So the point here is that the text is that text is geared toward protecting that right of a debt slave to go free after 6 years, but making sure that people realize that the master, this is part of what slavery was for.
Yeah.
Is to make more slaves.
Yeah.
And
it's a business.
That's what it did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a business.
So the idea that he'd be able to go back and, because think about it, if in this scenario we assume that Susie and the kids are contingent upon a debt, right? Their slavery is contingent upon a debt. Why in the world would Frank sign up for life? I mean, why would he do that? It just doesn't make sense.
No,
right? In the passage, it doesn't make sense. He would say, "All right, well, look, at worst case, he gave me Susie in like my 5th year. All right, so I got 4 or 5 more years on Susie's contract, maybe, and then she gets released. So it sucks, but I'll just kind of hang out and work, and then she'll get released." No, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. The passage is very clear. These are not debt slaves.
Well, it's the same thing for, in the Muslim crap fest. I mean, slavery, it's still up. Like now legally, if there's a war and everything, you can conduct slavery business like a Muslim nation. I mean, it is there. You take, you sell, you kill. That's it. It's still live. Wow. It was never taken out. There's no argument. There's apologetics, like, in Christianity now, in Islam, a lot. They are coming so hard because they realize it's so embarrassing. And you can't touch it. So you have to deal with it. So you have to explain it. You can't just put an amendment and all that stuff. In that spirit, like I've been always telling my friend Tim, we need to adjust our terminology in the recent times. We've been always bashing on religion and talking. I think we need to be specific and say the Abrahamic religions. Because since and correct us if we're wrong, a whole Assyriology and Mesopotamian history is very important a lot today because it unlocks and answers a lot of things. Don't you agree? There's a difference between ancient religions and the way they conducted themselves versus these 3 oddities.
Oh, yeah.
So we have to, when we say religion, we say Abrahamic religions because things change.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely by, later in like the Second Temple period, the end of the first millennium, the movement is definitely toward like more monotheistic or henotheistic with the Hebrew Bible. And this is just not a thing in, for example, Mesopotamian religion. You have a whole pantheon, right?
Yeah.
Like with the Greek gods, Roman gods. So this idea that you'd have, I mean, sure, there can be like a head deity, like An or Enlil, depending on the myth, could be like at the top. But I mean, they have their own weaknesses. They have their own characteristics that are very human. I mean, God, Enlil sends the flood because there's too much noise. And he can't sleep.
I read that.
Right?
I was like,
yeah, I mean, it's like,
it's ridiculous. They came complain about a lot of noise. So,
and that's what.
It's like going upstairs to shoot your neighbor because they're like stomping around or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's really not that different. And I think what's interesting for me in the position that I'm in, having studied the Syriology and also Hebrew Bible, is that now it's very clear the influence that Mesopotamia had, not only Mesopotamian religion, mythology, but also Canaanite. I mean, you look at, if you read through like the Baal cycle or, these other Ugaritic poems and texts, I mean, you'll see very clearly that there's direct influence, there's indirect influence, there are polemics. I think Genesis 1 is a great example of a text that is a polemic against a Mesopotamian myth. So, Genesis 1, it even starts off the same way. So the very important, I mean, incredibly important text, the Enuma Elish, which is the text that talks about the ascendancy of Marduk over the other deities, starts off, Enuma Elish are the first word, so when on high. And that's that type of clause, dependent clause, is how Genesis 1 starts. When God began to create the heavens and the earth. And I think it's very clearly a polemic against it. And I'm even more perhaps so is the flood story. We were just talking about the capricious nature of the Mesopotamian deities, Enlil, bringing the flood amongst other things that he brought to decimate humanity, because they were multiplying too much and making too much noise. And the god of Enlil is actually said, one of the other deities, Ea, actually says to him, "You've done this evil thing." I mean, so that, like, in the Mesopotamian story, Enlil's not the good guy, right? So if you're going to then incorporate that, so let's say you're a Judean scribe and you're trying to put down this tradition about a flood, and you've got this Mesopotamian story as your background. Well, how do you write your story where it's clear that you're pulling from and you're utilizing that flood myth that you see in places like Atrahasis, and yet turn it to your, spin it in your favor? So it's not about Marduk, it's about your God. Well, one of the things that you do is you can't have Yahweh being evil. You can't have Yahweh, bringing a flood because people are noisy. I mean, that doesn't look good. So if you look at Genesis 6, 1-4, I mean, it's like, and you can't, it's hard to find a passage there in the beginning of Genesis 6 that talks about how wicked humanity was. I mean, all the thoughts of their heart were only evil continually. I mean, it's like,
well,
they bad.
Generally, what I get the sense, like I said, the Abrahamic religions, the trilogy, the three, they kept copying and pasting from each other. They are very awful at looking at the human beings. It's like they don't support being human. It's like the human being is always bad. It's always negative. It's always like you're awful, punishments and stuff. And there was this Iraqi writer, and he's a historian. I mean, it's amazing. He did an extensive work. If you read Arabic, I'll send you his stuff. He went through trying to find the missing link, and he was hypothesizing that he has the Sumerian king lists, how they were turned into the prophets in the Bible. He linked them with each one of the prophets, including Adam, and he turned it back to the first king in Eridu, I think. Yeah. And he says when he has the first one that says, I got the power from the sky, instead of just. And it's fascinating when he weaves all these together and explains all these things, that how they were influenced from that. And what do you think?
I mean, I don't think there's any question. Seth Sanders is a doctor that wrote on this. in a very specific way. He's comparing Enoch, if you know the figure from the Bible,
Yes.
Enoch, to Adapa, and Adapa is he's this like wise sage of Enki, of
Yeah,
Ea.
he's his follower, or what do you call
Yes.
it, his minister. What
That's
I'm,
right.
I'm translating from Arabic. Even the name is called
Yep.
Adaba.
Mm. Yeah, and it's interesting to see the connections between a text, like the Book of First Enoch, which is admittedly much later, maybe the 3rd century BCE, but what First Enoch talks about in this. You guys probably know the story, but for other people that maybe don't, the angels, that story from Genesis 6 is developed quite a bit. So in Genesis 6, you have angels coming down and having sex with human women and giving birth. Well, that story is really developed in the Book of Enoch, First Enoch. And now these angels, gives the whole backstory, gives their names. It talks about they make a pact together that they're going to all go down and have sex with these women. And then their offspring and these giants. And, one of the things that happens is not only do they do that, that intermingling, making things impure or whatever, but they also teach humanity some of these like more divine wisdom things, these things that are only supposed to be for the gods, or the gods are supposed to give them out in a certain way. It just depends on you, I guess, the way you interpret the text. But this is what this theme, you see it throughout the ancient Near East, right? And even in Greek sources, Prometheus, is that the one that teaches
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 brings
fire?
light. Yeah, brings light to the humans.
So, like this trope of some intermediary bringing wisdom from the heavens to the earth. I mean, you see it in the Adapa myth. Adapa ends up going up into heaven, and he's offered this food and drink that will give him more immortality, and he declines it because his master, Ea, told him not to take it. And it's a way of, it's all about this wisdom that it gets down to earth, but how does it get down to earth, and how does it stay on earth, and how is it sort of segregated off? In the Gilgamesh epic, you see Utanapishtim, who's the flood
I was going to
survivor.
mention the Gilgamesh epic. Actually,
Yeah.
What they should teach that epic in school a lot.
I agree.
Because we all grew up infused with the Abrahamic sense of things, right? And then the first time I read it, and I was like, wait, what just happened? Like, common sense. You could give it to any kid, they will make the connection. And especially, like I said, coming from the Muslim stuff, in the Quran, there's a piece in there. It's like smack down in your face. I mean, whoever copied the story didn't even make an effort to twist it a little bit. But Moses was like, God damn it. It's like, can you at least try? But so in school, they should teach everything else. And then you should, as prerequisite, you need to read the Gilgamesh epic. Because that one piece of literature explains a lot.
Oh, yeah.
And then you have the, what do you call it? The Shurupak list of advices.
The instructions of Shurupak.
Yeah, the instructions of Shurupak. That's it. Game over.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many texts. And I would say the Baal cycle would be that Ugaritic text, reading that in English translation or in translation would be amazing.
Yeah.
Because these texts, they form cultural background. So in volume 2 of the book, I have an entire chapter that's going to be dedicated to just ancient Near Eastern background. So things like cosmology, religion, myths, law, those types of things, just to give the reader this broad background to not just the history, because we do the history in volume 1, but now sort of the rest of the story, because things like omens, medical texts, the way that they do science and how it comes through in the law collections, and then ultimately in the way we see the law codes, or the law section structured in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, it all goes together. And I think having that broad background will be really useful.
Oh, it does. And there's an extensive, like they left extensive records of these things, like that Iraqi writers I was mentioning. I mean, this guy is amazing. He did these books about this stuff. He just zeroed in on ancient Egypt, like a book, 600 pages or 700,
Wow.
just about like how they eat. I mean, he didn't go to like historical stuff. He researched, and they have the records, how they eat, what the customs are, what they do, how they get married. It's all there. And then he goes also to the Babylonians, the Ashur, Akkad, and all that stuff. And for each
That's
one,
awesome.
he made a book. I mean, years of work. And these people left a lot of records,
Yeah.
So, but in the Bible, if I'm gonna say this, and I want to see what you think for real. Like, give us your assumption. It's just a theory. Do you think, the people who wrote the Bible, like let's go back to the first dudes who just sat down to write the Old Testaments. They were sitting there in some desert, pointless. They made no contributions. They have no identity. They just look around these big civilizations, right? You have, the Egypt one side and everybody else on the other side. So they tried to give themselves purpose. They wrote some stuff. And also you can sense that because they have so much envy and hate in their books of these big civilizations. Because we have to place these people who wrote these books somewhere. I mean, why they hate so much the other civilizations that actually made contributions?
So it's probably really complicated the way that the final form of the Hebrew Bible came together. And like I'm writing the chapter on the Exodus right now, and just talking about what do we know about this thing that did it happen? Is there anything like it? Is it just some memory that they're drawing from? And I think that aspect of this kernel of historical truth, historical memory, plays a pretty big role in the way these things developed, particularly in the Hebrew Bible. So there are lots of different ways I think that the material came in for the Hebrew Bible. I mean, I definitely think that we have the scribes that were putting things together at certain points had access to like earlier, I don't call them historical records, but I mean, maybe for lack of a better term, records that talked about things that happened. When they put these, I mean, the text goes so far as to say that at times. But those are more, the more historical sounding books. So like Kings, I think even in Samuel, I think Samuel is, the whoever put Samuel together, the Deuteronomist or whatever, it's putting all this stuff together, is pulling from earlier materials. I don't think David is made up out of whole cloth, is what I'm saying. But for me, the bigger or the more interesting aspect of this is looking at how they utilize other mythology, like other texts, other stories, other religious texts, and how they incorporate them and rework them for themselves. And the example that I always give about this, because you mentioned earlier, like direct borrowing in the Quran, it's cut and paste, right? How you described it. Well, to us, we would call that like forgery or plagiarizing.
Copyright infringement.
Call that plagiarizing. Yeah, right. Copyright infringement. They didn't really look at it that way. So the example that I like to give is that really important story, the Enuma Elish, the story about Marduk, and it's recited at the New Year's festival every year. That story was incredibly important, not just to the Babylonians, but also to the Assyrians. Babylonia is sort of like this religious center. I mean, it's Sumer, right?
Of course, it's the big thing.
So the Assyrians revered. They often hated the Babylonians, but they revered them, right? And the cultural aspects that religious things that went behind. I mean, you got Nippur down there, Uruk, I mean, you've got all these big Kish,
the major spots.
I mean, and they're big for religious purposes. And so this New Year's festival, where this text was recited, is something that the Neo-Assyrian king would come down, and he would submit himself. The king would submit himself to the head of the Marduk priesthood. I mean, it was a big deal, right? So, at one point, later in the Neo-Assyrian period, Sennacherib was having real problems keeping control of the south, keeping control of Babylonia. And eventually he just kind of had it up to here with them. And he went down, and it seems like he did some bad stuff to the city of Babylon.
Dropped a hammer.
Yeah, it's what it seems like. And what we then see is a bunch of texts were taken back up to the north, taken back up into Assyria. And it's at this point that we see an Assyrian version of the Enuma Elish. So now if you think about it, and you guys may know all this stuff, so I apologize if you do, but just in case there are people listening that don't. The Enuma Elish, this story about Marduk. Marduk is the god of the south, right? He's the god of Babylonia, the main deity. And it talks about how he single-handedly, saves all the other gods by killing Tiamat. And at the end of the text, there are these 50 names that are given to Marduk, playing off of his Sumerian, the way his name is written in cuneiform. Well, that text shows up in the north, and you can go look at it, see fragments of it. Everywhere that Marduk, everywhere his name was, they just replaced it with Asher. And they did a slight modification, a very, very slight modification at the very beginning of the text, but the story just stays the same. They just, everywhere that Marduk's name is, they replace it with their god, Asher, who's the main deity of the north. Well, I mean, we look at that today and we go,
yeah, that's obviously copyright.
Yeah, I mean, come on, guys. So the first question that when I was studying this, the first question that came to my mind was, well, these people knew clearly the story of the Enuma Elish. I mean, they heard it every year. So what, are they just buying into the idea that it was Asher all along? And I mean, the thing is, when you replace Marduk's name with Asher, the last section of the text just makes no sense, because all those 50 names are based off of Marduk's name. You can't base them off Asher's. It's a completely different thing. But the salient point, the thing that I think is important to draw out from that, is that it wasn't so much a question of, did it happen exactly this way? I don't think that was the issue. The issue was, your text says Marduk. And what we're going to do, it's almost like, I don't know, it would almost be like, my kids have a Nintendo Switch upstairs, right? And if one of them likes to play Mario Party and the other one likes to play Mario Odyssey. Well, when you push the little, don't know what you can call it, the little game.
The joystick.
Well, I was thinking the game piece, the little square game piece.
The cartridge.
The cartridge. That's what it is. When you push it down and pop it out and put the new one in, everything changes, right? It's not a matter, you don't have to rework the whole console.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of my game is in there now.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Yeah. That's actually a good analogy. You're not building a new Switch. You're just putting a new card.
Yeah, that's right. And it didn't matter. I mean, it didn't matter that the story didn't change. There's power.
They were taking ownership of it. That's pretty much it.
Yeah.
So just say that we own this mythology now.
And it didn't even matter that did it happen this way or didn't it? The fact that Asher's name is now in the story in and of itself imbues it with power.
Yeah, that's
imbues this idea with power. And that's why when you come to, like, what is it? Psalm, I always forget which Psalm it is, where it talks about Yahweh as the rider on the clouds. It might be Psalm 136. I can't remember. 132. I don't know. I'm probably way off. It's probably like 73 or something, but Psalms aren't things that I work with. But, it talks about how Yahweh is the rider on the clouds. That's an epithet of Baal. I mean, strictly an epithet of Baal.
Wow.
But that's exactly what they're doing. They're saying, not Baal, Yahweh. Yahweh is the one that does this. And that's why when you look at these stories where it's clear that Genesis 6-9 is utilizing an older Mesopotamian tradition, like there's no question. It's this consensus scholarship. That it didn't matter that they're essentially reusing the story. They're reworking it in just the right way to say, actually, Yahweh is the one that brought the flood. And look, Yahweh did it.
Man, now that makes sense so much, the way he explained it. Wow.
Hey, Dean.
Yeah.
You know what we got to do now, right?
What?
We got to just take the New Testament, replace God's name with just Cthulhu.
Yeah, that's it.
Set.
We're going to do the same thing. We've been discussing it for a while. It's like, we're going to take Cthulhu and just drop it in there. And take all three books, compile them together, and just go for it. But to say why there is so much despise for like Egypt and Babylon in those books. So I understand, people will take and borrow from each other. Did they inherit animosities, because these are two powers, like, Russia and United States, and then you have in the middle some nobody, and then wrote a book, and then taking a shit on Russia and United States. Yes, they're big powers. They did some things, but they did some good stuff and all that. So what's the hate? And now we have to live with that hate. Like now we have like pharaohs and assholes. Now the records are showing the pharaohs were not assholes. Right. They were actually decent people. So, and then Babylon was not filled by whores and shit, So how now we are all have a reflex in your head. When you hear Babylon, when you hear Pharaoh, it's like a piece of shit.
Yep.
How can we get rid of that and correct history?
I think knowing where it comes from, right? And this is why I think understanding the history of the region, the geography of the region, those things are so important. And again, what I'm getting ready to say, you guys know. And probably your audience knows too, but just in case.
That's the point of doing this, to make them know.
Right.
Yeah.
That's why we need you.
So the Southern Levant, that Palestine, where these things are taking place in Israel and Judah, it's this narrow strip of land along the Mediterranean coast, and off to the east, you've got desert, right? It's really hard to traverse the desert,
tough terrain.
And so, but then you've got all of Anatolia. You've got Syria, Mesopotamia. Further off to the east, you've got Iran, the Indus Valley, all that stuff. Everything's off to the east. And then you come through this little strip of land, and then you've got Egypt, Nubia, all that stuff. So how do you get from even Greece? How do you get down to the south, and how does the south get back up to the north? It's got to go through Palestine, right?
It's the route.
It's the route, and that's why there are two major routes that run through the King's Highway and the Way of the Sea. Right, you've got two major, land routes that go through Palestine, and because of that, you have interaction all the time between these major powers on both sides of whoever was living in Canaan, right, in this land. And furthermore, or coupled with this, is the fact that nobody in Canaan was ever terribly powerful, right? There were periods that the Canaanites, like during the third millennium, you see them sort of grow and expand. You get this big monumental architecture, and they kind of grow up. And then at the end of the third millennium, seems like we have some type of a climactic change, and that, the drying out of the region. And so people leave the cities because they can't sustain themselves with agriculture anymore. They move into more pastoral nomadism. And then later on during the Middle Bronze Age, they come back because everything sort of comes back, rainfall comes back. And so then people move back into these major cities and build them back up. But the point is that particularly by the time you get to the late Bronze Age, there's a period of time called the Amarna period.
Yeah.
And we know so much about it because we have these, 382, I think, different texts that we found in the Egyptian city of El Amarna. And they tell us about two types of countries, two types of nations. Those that are part of the Great Powers Club. So Assyria, Babylonia, Egypt, Hatti, Mitanni, Elashia, Arzawa. These are like major powers, and they all call each other brother, and they all send gifts to each other. It's this international diplomacy, period of international diplomacy. And caught in the middle of all of it is the land of Canaan. And we know that the land of Canaan is just full of these little city-states, these sort of nobodies. So we have letters, the bulk of the letters that we have that were found in Amarna are between the Pharaoh and his vassals in Canaan. So there are all these little infighting city-states. Egypt is in control of Canaan for the late Bronze Age, down into like the 12th century.
Yeah,
I think they maintain control. And you can imagine the way that this is set up. Egypt has outposts, has officials. They've broken up Canaan into provinces, 2 or 3 of them, I think. I mean, it's bad news for the Canaanites, because Egypt is pulling slaves from there. Egypt is pulling tribute. They're under the dominion of Egypt. There's a little bit of interplay later with Hatti in the north, but for the most of it, you can just, Egypt controls Canaan. So they don't have any real power. They're seeing these major powers come through their land and work things out. And then furthermore, so getting down now to the biblical period, once right around 1177, I think is when Eric Klein dates it, there's this civilization systems collapse that takes place all throughout the Mediterranean. And that causes Egypt to lose control over Canaan, and which allows these independent nations to break off and to start to develop themselves. So now you see the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, right? The Philistines. The Philistines are part of the Sea Peoples movement that came down, and they came back up into Canaan. So now they're settling along the coast. So now Israel, what ultimately becomes Israel, this Canaanite group of Canaanites that coalesce and move up into the highlands, what is defining them seems to be, or what is uniting them together is probably fighting with the Philistines, with the Edomites, with the Ammonites, all these people that are around them. And of course, there's already animosity that's built up with Egypt, right? Because they've been enslaved. The Canaanites were enslaved for all that time. So now Israel develops its own identity, in contrast to the place around it. So when you see, look at places like the book of Amos or the book of Ezekiel or Isaiah, Jeremiah, you see this type of text that's called the oracles against the nations. And that's exactly what you see. The prophets are talking shit, essentially, about all these nations that are around them. Edom is going to be utterly destroyed, and the Ammonites, God's always going to wipe them out. And
so they were interpreting their frustrations on these texts. So they were like reflecting that in the texts.
Yeah, I think it's the natural. It's the way that it developed. They didn't like these people.
So we can consider the Bible, I guess, a propaganda piece.
Oh my God! Of course, yeah.
I mean it's obvious. I mean, we're crapping on each other. So I'm gonna call you stuff. You're gonna call me stuff, and it goes down in a book.
I mean, if you read through Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions, I mean, you see the exact same shit, right? I mean, like, you read, and that we have lots of them, which is really cool. I mean, you can go read them from the originals, but. I mean, these royal inscriptions will say things like, the new Assyrian Empire, one of the things that sort of defined them was this annual campaigning, particularly out to the west. And so the king would go and he'd do a circuit, right? He'd go campaign every year. He'd go out and campaign, get tribute, and subject these people. And when you read about that, I'd be like, that's some shit to do to people, right? So how do you justify it? Well, you read through these royal inscriptions and they're like, the god Asher, their deity, extended his benevolent arm out to the nations, that are over here to the west. And they spurned his benevolent, mercies and love and fought and rebelled against the god Asher. And so as the king, I have to go, subject the rebellious, wicked people that are out to the west because, I'm doing this for God. And it's like, yeah, I mean, it's what you see in the Bible. Like, come on, people, this is not complicated. This creating of the other. So to sort of, I'll finish that up and then I'll stop rambling. But by the time you get to,
it is enlightening and fun.
Well, I'm glad it's. So at the end of the 8th century, of course, 722, this is when the northern tribe, this is when Samaria falls to the Assyrian Empire, Neo-Assyrian Empire. And then, 150 years later, something like that, in 586, under the Neo-Babylonian Empire, this is when Jerusalem falls, right? And all these people in Jerusalem, so you've got people from the north that have trickled down, have come down into the south, right? Some of them were taken away. Some of them people were brought in, but you've got people that were left in the land and it's been decimated. So they kind of make their way down into the south, into Judah. And now, Nebuchadnezzar II comes along, kicks ass, takes names, and, 586 destroys, the temple. And, now he brings all these people into captivity. And so now animosity has built with the Babylonians who've done all this stuff to them. And of course with the Assyrians, which were done to people up in the north. And so they spend, 60 some years in captivity there. And then in 539, Cyrus comes along and frees them. The Persian Empire frees them and they're allowed to go back. Well, I mean, they've spent 70 years in captivity. They've heard every year that they've been there, this Akitu festival, right? I mean, like they heard the Enuma Elish. They know all about Marduk. They know all about their
They're
mythology.
familiar with the materials.
Very familiar. So what you would expect if you're going to write a polemic against a particular, group of people's mythology, and you're going to see some stuff worked out against the Babylonians. And so like the animosity existed with Egypt, probably just by tradition, but certainly, you see interactions throughout the first millennium with Egypt and Palestine. And, then you have them going into captivity. So, I mean, like that animosity, I would be surprised if I didn't see it. And it comes out in the text. I mean, the passage was at Psalm 137 that everybody quotes all the time about blessed is he who dashes your little ones up against, their heads up against the rocks.
Oh God.
This is like,
God
it's
damn
funny
it.
to hear apologists. Yeah. I mean, it's funny to hear apologists tackle that because they're like, oh, you don't understand the context because this is just them, they're in captivity in Babylonia and they're really upset. And so this is just sort of hyperbole, but this isn't God. Well, I hate to break it to you, but, to Christian apologists, but go read through the prophets. Like the word of the Lord is, I'm going to kick ass and take names, right, of all of your enemies. This is just in keeping with what's coming in their minds. So like Psalm 137, it's not good. You can't just sort of, sort of brush it off and say, oh, that's just people being upset and
Well,
talking.
the same. It's the same tactics, just like in Islam. They're trying to explain, a genocide of an entire tribe of Jewish people in there. That their prophet just literally chopped them in one day. Well, God came to him and said, you got to continue and do all this stuff. The reality is he just came back from a fight and he got his teeth kicked in. He's broke. He has soldiers he needs to pay. And there's, a bunch of Jewish people there just chilling, working. Okay, they have money. They have some lands. We need cash. And that's the pattern for the last, I don't know, the last 8 years of his life or something. That was the patterns. Like the guy was like going to war every month. You gotta. So it's the same tactics. You can't justify these things. So in summation,
as
I guess,
much as they try.
Yeah, we can't.
Sorry.
So we have to agree now that these books or this book, the Bible, we can't trust a book that is propaganda / emotionally infused with hate and shit because people were having things against each other. I can't trust a document that.
Yeah, I mean,
Can I?
I guess it depends on what you mean by trust. Like there are different things that you can pull. So let's take it away from the Bible or the Quran or anything that people might be sensitive about. Let's just take it back to
we're trying to help them get over the sensitivity.
Right. Well, I think hopefully this will do it. So like the Babylonian Chronicles, right? We have make it something really propagandistic. These royal inscriptions that we see. You can look at Sargon's 8th campaign, this really long text that talks about Sargon fighting Urartu up to the north. Well, I mean, he says some crazy ass shit in there, right? Like he single-handedly ran ahead of his armies and took a bronze axe and cut through the mountain himself, and it's like, okay, did that happen? Probably not, right? But did they fight Urartu? Yeah. I mean, like we know they did. So there's a difference between what I see as many Christian apologists is sort of swallowing the pill whole and saying, okay, well, if it said that the sun stood still for a goddamn day, well, it must have stood still for a day. And if Jonah was swallowed by a big fish, well, then he was swallowed by a big fish. And we have to find articles that show how people can be swallowed by fish. And it's like, miss me with that shit. There's another way that you can do this. And the other way is to recognize the propaganda, to recognize, when it is that they're saying something that you can say is historically reliable. A perfect example, David. Joel Baden wrote a book. He's up at Yale and a Hebrew Bible scholar, brilliant guy. And he wrote a book on David. And David has his own apologetics. He has his own political spin in the book, like in the writings there in the Deuteronomistic history. So if I were to say to you, hey, there's a, like if you went up to a police officer on the street and you said, hey, there's a guy that sent 3 men to this store owner who's got this big bay window, this like big, beautiful storefront, glass storefront, or glass window out front. I can't think of what it's called now. And the 3 guys walked inside and said, that is a beautiful window. Be a shame for anything to happen to it. Tell you what we're going to do. If you pay us $10,000, we will make sure that nobody breaks that window. Or even better, hey, you need to pay us $10,000 because for the past month, we've been making sure that nobody breaks your window. Right? Well, I mean, the cop, who's the bad guy and who's the good guy, right? And those. Well, I mean, obviously the mobster people that are coming in and threatening the shop owner, we're going to bust up your window if you don't pay us 10 grand. Well, he's the bad guy. Well, in the book of Samuel, David sends a couple of his guys ahead to this guy, Naval, and says, hey, we've been protecting your sheep, like your flocks out in the fields. So you need to give us some money and some resources. And the guy Naval says, what? No. Well, then all of David's henchmen come, including David. And lo and behold, Naval ends up dead. And David has possession of his wife and all his stuff.
Wow.
Well, I mean, that's mobster shit. But if you read through the book of Samuel, my God, David is a hero. And that Naval guy, man, he is awful. In fact, his own wife goes out to David and apologizes for how stingy he was for not taking care of David's men. I mean, it's like,
this is hilarious because the same tactics. Muhammad goes to Medina. He's fighting with his own people and family. He goes randomly to these people living, minding their own business, says, okay, you need to sign this piece of paper to help me out and do stuff. And those Jewish tribal Christians just say, look, man, we don't want to get into trouble. We're always the first one to get punched. You have a problem with your family. Well, no, now they are traitors because, the other tribe came to fight him. Now you betrayed me and you deserve punishment. So let's take your stuff. And guess what? Because he has a gang of thugs with him and he has a bunch of people coming in, he needs rooms for them to stay and stuff. So it's the same thing. Yeah. I mean, how can we trust these people who are using the same tactics for centuries?
Right. So in the same vein, that's a really good example, a good comparison. So in the same vein, we could say, all right, yeah, I mean, David did this, right? We could say that David had this gang of Apiru and he went around and did this sort of militant shit, right? And extorted people. So from a historical standpoint, we can say he probably did that. But that doesn't mean that we say that we now follow David or the messages that he gave, like his advice or something that we see in the text. Do we follow that? No. I mean, in the same way that we can say Sargon, whose name Shahrukhin means the king is legitimate, you could probably know that he wasn't legitimate, right? He's probably a usurper. Because why would you name yourself the king is legitimate?
Well, you know what?
Because you're probably not, right? I mean,
it's hilarious that we laugh at these stuff, but here's the danger. Okay, you have a billion and a half people on the planet. You're born and raised and embedded with this automatic instinct. Jew, bad. Yeah. They're traitors. They killed Christ or they betrayed Muhammad and everything. It's like you can't shake that feeling from your head. Yeah. I was born into it, so I know how it feels. That's a dangerous proposition. So yes, we could joke about the stories now. We know that they're just stupid shit or whatever or funny. Yeah. But the impact of this stuff, how can we get rid of that? That's what I was saying. Exposing your work Assyriology, I think the key and the answer for this stuff is in that. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, all that area is key. Like, it's more relevant and important today than ever. And we have the records. I mean, these people were awesome at record keeping. They left so much. You go to Islam, it's like the most important, holiest of the shit. The 20 years of, there's no records. It's a black hole for historians. They can't find anything. So you're telling me you're awesome, your religion is awesome, but you didn't know how to write? I mean, you still can't agree on a version of your book? Do you have 10 readings of it? Because your prophet says it was, sent in 7 letters or 7 tongues. I mean, come on. So that's the fight.
Yeah. And I think to sort of piggyback on that, I think a really good example of this that I think everybody listening would agree to is Naram Sin. So Naram Sin, if people don't know, was the grandson of Sargon of Akkad, who created the first dynasty in Mesopotamia. And Naram Sin did some pretty amazing stuff, created this whole administrative system, developed it. He was just very industrious, what he did. But there was a point in his reign when he was attacked. Now, the texts that we have, and they're contemporary texts. They're not like thousands of years later. They're contemporary texts, and you can go see them. Talk about, in many different places, talk about how he fought 9 battles in 1 year. And some of the texts talk about, they actually name who the participants were. These coalitions that were formed, one from the north, one from the south. At any rate, they say that they attacked his city of Akkad. Sorry. And he defeated them. And because of this great defeat that he was able to perform, the people of the city of Agaday were so excited and so grateful that they requested of all the gods that they make Naram Sin divine. So we have documents, contemporary documents talk about this, right? Stories, texts, royal inscriptions, we got it, right? You can go read it. Yeah. Well, then we start seeing in the administrative tablets, like in the cuneiform tablets, that are not propagandistic. They're like, 2 sheep and 1 goat.
Yeah, record
given
keeping,
to the temple
basic stuff. Yeah.
They dated tablets and text during that time based on things that the king did that year. Well, Naram Sin's name starts showing up with the divine determinative. It starts showing up with the symbol of the star before his name, which means he's a god. It starts showing up like that. Then we have this victory stele of Naram Sin. And, anybody can Google it and you can see an image of it. But it's got Naram Sin conquering his enemies, the Lelubians, and he's much bigger than everybody else. And he's wearing this helmet that's a horned helmet. Guess what that means? Only the gods wear the horned helmet. Means he's a god, right? Then we have later literary texts that talk about, that start to vilify Naram Sin, right? Well, because why would they single out Naram Sin to vilify? It's weird. So what's the most reasonable assumption, given all this data? We have contemporary textual data that talks about he was made a god. We know why they say he was made a god. We have administrative text that starts showing him as being called a god. We have this, this stele that has him depicted as a god, and the text on the stele says he's a god. What's the most reasonable conclusion? Well, I mean, nobody's going to answer that and say, well, that he was actually made a god. Nobody's going to say that, right? We all know what the most reasonable conclusion is. He's the king, and he wanted to make himself divine. Well, right. pick that up and put it over on something like the divinity of Jesus, right? we have so much more contemporary information and evidence of Naram's sin being made divine than we do about Jesus being made divine, right? But people are willing to go with it, right? Minimal facts, right? The minimal facts. Well, what are the
Yeah.
minimal facts? Well, what's the most reasonable conclusion? Well, is it that Naram's sin was made a god? No. And is it that Jesus was actually a god? It's not my field. I'm not a New Testament scholar, but I mean, like, no,
It's
I
obvious.
don't think so. So just because documents say things and multiple lines of evidence point to things in the textual record doesn't mean that they're true. You have to be able, as a historian, you've got to be able to sort of work through that and go, okay, why might they say that? And what can we glean from it? It's sort of the whole rake in the good stuff and shovel out the bad. Like, you've got to be able to do that with these ancient texts. And
well, I think
that's the way.
We're old enough now as a species. We know how we do stuff. It's obvious. It's like Rome. Did that. Everybody did that. Your Napoleon did the same thing. Everybody. We know the tactics. So. And then also, the floodgates of all these records now are pumping through the internet everywhere. It's available. You don't have to be a scholar anymore to look at this stuff. As a matter of fact, that's how I came across your channel many years ago, like when you guys, the first 2 lessons you put for how to learn Sumerian. Since I was a kid, I was always fascinated by Sumerians. I loved the Sumerians since I was a kid, but I never thought I'll reach anywhere, And one day I was like, you know what? I was trying to learn stuff, but it's always good to read the thing in its own language, I was like, let me try and see, maybe there's a book how to learn Sumerian. Bam, the first 2 lessons popped, and I dove right in. I was like, wait a minute,
awesome.
This guy's doing this? So I took the lessons, man. I was like, listening to the first channel, I was like waiting for the next one and the next one.
Yeah.
And, I'm going back now because the first time I went, because I was so fascinated, it was like that someone actually did this. And now I'm going back and I'm like, zero in. I'm going to take 1 lesson and just like live with it for like a month or something. I need to like, but that's how I came across.
You have a copy of the book?
No, it's actually, that's the next thing I'm getting. I didn't know you have a book. Yeah. I was like, oh, wait, because I was using the videos over and over. And then I realized you have the book.
This is so much nicer. So we cover all this. We cover a little bit more material in the book. But the nice thing about it is Megan took some time and like drew out hand copies of stuff.
Yeah.
And like she really did it. And the thing is, by the time you get to the end of the book, you can read that. It's brilliant.
Yeah. No, the videos
awesome.
help, man. I was at work during lunch, I go and, sit there and I'm like repeating, writing, trying to write this stuff. But it was, it was fascinating.
If
I can read.
If you can, if you feel comfortable sending me a mailing address privately, we'll send you a copy of the book for free.
Oh, I was actually going to ask you if I could get your, what do you call it? P.O. box or something. I have a book for you.
Oh, okay.
I have something for you. I think you're going to enjoy a lot.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, I think Dr. Josh, thank you very much. I know you have something coming up at 9:15 or 10:15, you said?
Oh, I'm glad you said that.
Yeah. You see, I'm keeping track of your stuff.
Thank you.
I knew you have a lecture or something going on, so we don't want to keep you up. Go ahead.
Real quick.
Tim is a Jehovah Witness, by the way.
Yeah, I grew up with all that. I know you say you do the whole New Testament, but do you maybe offhand real quick know what the real big difference between the New Testament and Old is? Like, what kind of correlation, like what was the main difference? Because I grew up more with the New Testament being involved with Jehovah's Witnesses.
The difference between the Old and New Testaments.
Or
I would say the big
name.
Yeah, so it's Testament means covenant. So it's like the old covenant and the new covenant.
Oh, that's
Um,
what that.
I guess the way that I would describe it is I think the New Testament writers are trying to work out the messiahship. This is very rough, but I think they're trying to work out how could Jesus have been the Messiah and we still had him die, right? We still have these things transpired. How does this fit? How does this make sense? So like definitely Paul, like there's no question. I think that Paul is doing that. Like how do you have a Messiah that dies? How does that work? So they're utilizing the Hebrew Bible as in a way that like you can have something like Hosea 11, out of Egypt I have called my son, and you apply that to Jesus, who fled to Egypt as a child and then came back up. Like, that's not what Hosea 11:1's about. Come on.
Right.
You know, in Isaiah 53, that's not what Isaiah 53 is about, you know, the suffering servant. It's completely different. But they're able to take those and sort of like a near and far referent, you know, like, oh, yeah, so out of Egypt I've called my son. Yeah, that had something to do with Hosea and his time. But, you know, God is using that to actually inform what was happening here in the first century CE. So I think that's probably the best way to describe it is it's a theological, it's much more a theological book. Obviously the Old Testament has its different theologies as well, but they're really like trying to piece together, I think, how the Messiah can still fit in with what we see in the Hebrew Bible and yet the events that we saw transpire.
Well,
if that makes sense.
The Quran tried to do the same thing. He came to explain how Muhammad is the Messiah, and he told, the Jewish community, they told him, no, you're not. Well, he accused them for, falsifying the records and saying, I'm the Messiah, just like your children. So I was like, yeah, so it's the same game. That's hilarious.
It's just a continuous cycle. It's funny
they
because
do it today.
Yeah.
Sorry, Tim, go ahead.
That's why we pray to Cthulhu. We don't see him in depths in the ocean, so we don't care, and he doesn't care. It's a joke religion. It's not it's not real.
We'll call it a joke when we got our own temple and we don't have to pay taxes anymore.
There you go.
Dr. Josh, man, thank you so much. We could talk to you for hours. We're going to hijack you again. But
sounds good. This was a lot of fun.
All right. Awesome. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, I will bow out and
say hi to Megan and the kids.
Sure get everything ready. I definitely will. Right. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you. Sit, Tim. That was very insightful. Yeah.
It was.
You just got lectured in ancient stuff.
Yeah. Man, he was there's a lot of that history that I completely unaware of, but as I said, I grew up with the New Testament. But I mean, they're similar stories, and it's basically the same book.
What about his book? I mean, you read the book. I mean, it's packed.
Yeah.
It wasn't a joke. I mean, the title meant what it meant. I mean, I thought it was spot on, man.
Which, if you haven't, shout out his book.
100%.
Definitely get volume 2, and
we're waiting for volume 2. It's the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. Read it, God damn it, so you know the truth.
The truth behind the bullshit.
On that note, peace, Timmy.
Peace.
May the tentacles be with you. Bang.